Only the arm.
What's that?
Oh, we're live. Everybody went quiet.
We did it. Keep up a witty banter as we wait to officially get going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's live on Facebook. We're already a success right now.
Done.
Low bar.
Travis, did you get your Old Ox at Old Ox, or did you get it from the grocery store?
I got it from Old Ox in Middleburg. They have a little like window side service there, so you don't have to really go in or interact with anyone. Just walk up and get your beer and go.
I think I saw that they're converting to doing some hand sanitizer also.
That's great.
Yeah, so I got a couple from Beltway. Catoctin Creek has been doing it for a couple weeks. I know Old Ox is starting to, or maybe already does. So I think several of them are starting to switch over, which is cool to see.
Yeah, I keep seeing the lines around the block at Catoctin Creek whenever they do sanitizer releases. So pretty wild.
That, and it was, I didn't want to get involved in the whole line thing to go there for it. So
right.
That way it was.
I will say this: Old Ox is doing food takeaway as well, at least from their Middleburg location. So you can get food, and they even have like family packs that'll feed like 4 people or something like that. It's pretty good.
Awesome.
Hold off. So Andrea just lets us know that we're on the other pages, and we can go ahead and get started.
Yep, I just made sure that we're up on Mosby Heritage Area's page.
I'm so distracted by all this plaid. This is gonna
Too much plaid.
It's a dazzle camo.
Here.
I have specific tartans that I need to wear when I do Scottish live streams. I try to match, but I felt like this screamed like 6 counties in Northern Virginia. Maybe it's because it's from Costco, but let me tell you, the Costco fashion line. If I'm looking for a sponsor for my life, Costco fashion.
Monks, Costco fashion. You have a whole branding world ahead of you.
This is it. Listen, I'm all about Walmart on the 4th of July. I'm all about Costco year round. You just got to know what you're aiming for.
That's very wise.
Keeping it local.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think we can go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another episode of History on Tap. I am Joe Rizzo with the Loudoun Museum, and as always, I am joined by Anne-Marie Paquette and Travis Shaw of the Mosby Heritage Area Association. And our guest tonight is James Taub, a military historian, and he is going to join us for our topic tonight, which is war and memory. And with this, we are going to span multiple centuries, several wars, and we want to get your questions and comments from the comment section on Facebook. We've got Andrea behind the scenes, as always, watching your comments and questions, and we'll be adding those into our conversation throughout the night. But first and foremost, I'm curious to know what everyone's drinking. So Travis, what do you got going on over there?
So I am drinking FestivAle. It's from Old Ox Brewing, which has multiple locations out in our area, Ashburn and Middleburg. And it is a cherry saison. They brew it every year for the Cherry Blossom Festival. Obviously, that was kind of a bust this year, but the beer is still excellent. Very tart, very refreshing.
That sounds like my kind of beer. What are you going to talk about tonight?
I'm, as usual, talking about the Revolutionary War and kind of, I'll be talking about the visit of the Marquis de Lafayette to the United States in the 1820s and kind of how people remember the Revolutionary War during that time.
Awesome. And Anne-Marie, what are you drinking and what are you talking about?
Well, first I'd like to comment that I think that beer's descriptor should be put on Travis's profile if he has one, tart and refreshing, just as a nice byline.
That might
so
be the
I'm
nicest
actually
thing you've ever said about me, Anne-Marie.
I mean it as a compliment, or I'm calling you a tart. I don't know which. We'll see. But I'm drinking Final Glide. It's from Lost Rhino here in Loudoun County. And I'll be talking about the Civil War and how a generation or two removed from the Civil War, how some of the narratives and the memories of those wars seem to change, to morph or evolve.
Very cool. And James, our guest, what are you going to get into tonight?
Unfortunately, I'm just drinking water out of a cool Michigan mug because I got to represent, even if we're in Mosby territory. But I'm going to be talking about the First World War. And I'm going to be talking about memory, how it impacts us today, and ways in which we think and engage with it every day.
Awesome. And I am drinking HOV by Beltway Brewing Company. They've switched over to hand sanitizer, but they've got some good stouts. They've got some good ales. So I'm happy to be drinking some Beltway Brewing Company. They do an awesome to-go order setup there. And I'm going to get into World War II. In particular, I'm going to look at the concept of the greatest generation and how it forms, and maybe some myths that come from the World War II era. So once again, as a reminder, we love to get feedback in the comment sections. If you have questions you want us to bring into, between Andrew and myself, we're monitoring those. So let us know anything that comes up as we're discussing these multiple wars over spans of centuries. But we might as well go ahead and get started. And Travis, why don't you pick up with the Revolutionary War?
All right, yeah, I'm going to start things off on September 11th, 1777. Pretty dark day for America. Just to set the scene, the British Army has marched into southeast Pennsylvania. They're on their way to Philadelphia, the capital of the newly minted United States. And Washington is desperately trying to stop them from reaching the city. So he's basically fighting for the life of his country along Brandywine Creek there in southeast Pennsylvania. And one of the most pivotal moments in this battle occurs when the British actually flank Washington's army. They take this like 17-mile march around Washington's army and start approaching his completely unguarded right flank. And there's nothing standing between the British army and just smashing Washington, destroying the Continental Army in one swoop. So to react to this, Washington sends as many troops as he can to shore up that flank. And one of the first units on the scene is the 3rd Virginia Regiment. Now, the 3rd Virginia has a very special place in my heart because it is our local regiment from here in Northern Virginia. I mean, this is the cream of the crop as far as guys from Loudoun County, Fauquier County, Prince William County. I mean, if you look at the officers of this regiment, their names that we still recognize today. The guy commanding the 3rd Virginia at Brandywine is Thomas Marshall. He's the father of future Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall, Fauquier County. Charles West of West's Ordinary down near Aldie, Virginia, he's commanding a company. John Mercer, who's the uncle of Charles Fenton Mercer, another famous Aldie resident, he's commanding a company. You've got John Ashby, whose uncle gave the name Ashby's Gap, an area so central to our region. He's there commanding a company. So it really is a who's who of our local area. And it's their job, this one regiment, a few hundred guys, have to blunt this British attack that's coming towards them. The full might of Howe's army is heading towards them. So they're going to take up positions around a Quaker meeting house, the Birmingham Meeting House, and they are going to hold that position for nearly an hour. Horrendous casualties, some of the toughest fighting of the battle is going to happen there. And it's their action that allows Washington to begin shifting more and more troops there to stabilize that line. Now, as they're starting to fall back, they're running out of ammunition, they've taken a lot of casualties. They're going to run into advancing Continental troops that are being sent to reinforce them, including a brigade of Pennsylvanians. And at their head is the 20-year-old Marquis de Lafayette. Now, Lafayette has just arrived in America that summer. When he shows up, he's 19 years old. Nobody knows him. He's just, looking for some action. He's looking for a way to play a part in this American Revolution. And this is his first taste of battle. Lafayette really doesn't know what he's doing, but he's enthusiastic. He's charging ahead with these Pennsylvanians to shore up the line. And somewhere along the Birmingham Road, Lafayette is hit. He's struck in the leg by a British round. He falls from his horse. And according to some accounts, it's men from the 3rd Virginia, specifically John Ashby, an officer in the 3rd Virginia, who rushes to his side as he lays there wounding. Now, of course, Pennsylvanians, they dispute this. They were there. Really, who knows? We know right about where he was wounded. It's not very close to where the monument is today. But anyways, So Lafayette is wounded. The American army falls back. Washington will lose the Battle of Brandywine, but it does not spell the end of the American Revolution because of action of men like those in the 3rd Virginia and others, the Pennsylvanians and so forth, who held that line long enough for Washington to get his army out safely and live to fight another day. It's really a dramatic moment, as a lot of battles are, but that stand of the 3rd Virginia at the Birmingham Meeting House is a fundamental part of this battle. And it's something that will be remembered distinctly and vividly 50 years later. And that's really what I want to get into talking about. 50 years later, the 1820s, the United States is radically different than it was in the 1770s. Obviously, we've been a nation for 50 years. It's the middle of what we refer to today as the era of good feelings. During James Monroe's presidency, there's not a lot of political strife and infighting. The Federalist Party has been defeated. So it's generally considered to be one of those few short periods in American history where like everything is okay. Now, of course, that all depends on your perspective, because if we look beyond this political era of good feelings, we're seeing, sectional crisis is rising. 1820, we have the Missouri Compromise, the argument over slave and free states entering the Union is starting to rear its head. We're starting to really see the politicization of, the slave power in the federal government. But it's also an interesting period because it's 50 years after the Revolution. So this is a time when many Revolutionary War veterans are beginning to die off. It's something that, I remember growing up seeing so many World War II veterans, and now we're getting down to the end of that generation. I'm sure that's something you'll talk about, Joe, but I imagine a very similar feeling. Here's this incredible generation that went through all this suffering and all this hardship, and we're losing them, more and more of them every day. So it's a really interesting time. James Monroe is in the White House. He's the last real Revolutionary War veteran to occupy the White House. Incidentally, he served in the 3rd Virginia. So it all kind of comes together with that one regiment in my mind. So Monroe will actually invite the Marquis de Lafayette back to America for the 50th anniversary of the Revolution. He says, quote, to instill the spirit of 1776 into this generation. I think there's a lot of kind of anxiety with the revolutionary or founding generation of who are we passing this torch to? Who are we putting the American experiment in the hands of? Can we trust these people? Do they get it? So this is the beginning of what I like to think of as probably the greatest party in American history, because it goes on for more than a year. Lafayette agrees to come to America. Yeah, it's wild. It's really fun. His tour of the United States is going to begin August 15th, 1824 in New York City. So his ship lands in New York. And it's everything that you can imagine. It's, parades, fireworks, speeches, balls, feasts. And they talked about one dinner he had where there were 24 entrees just in the first course alone. I mean, it's insane. And gifts, people start showing up and giving him the strangest things. Somebody gives him a live rattlesnake, America. Somebody gives him a 70-foot long model of the Erie Canal, which of course is built up. Yeah, right.
I think.
Every little podunk town he goes to in the United States, everybody turns out to, show off what's best about their area. And when I say every podunk town, he literally visits every state. There are 24 states at the time. He goes to every single one. He travels about 6,000 miles all told. And it's, like I said, it's a nonstop party. Every day it's on to the next town, on to the next feast, on to the next ball, on to the next,
for this guy, man.
Yeah, I feel bad for him because he's an older guy at this point, and that must have been absolutely exhausting for him.
He's French.
Yeah,
he's used to this.
I feel like now we are all quarantining because he partied so hard.
Oh
like
man,
in the grand balance of being inside or outside, that's
yeah. There was
We've
no
gotta balance it
social
back out,
distance.
okay.
But yeah, if you want to read more about this, his secretary, who traveled with him, Auguste Lavasseur, writes kind of his diary of this year or so that they spent in America, and it is just so funny reading about all the places they go and all the strange experiences they have. So on August 6th, 1825, so a year into his trip to America, Lafayette will leave Washington and he will come out to Loudoun County. By this point, Monroe has left the White House and retired to his country home, which is Oak Hill, which is just south of Leesburg, just a few miles. So they arrive there. The secretary says that, Monroe was a farmer, pleasantly settled in this handsome house near his farm. And, those of us who have been to Oak Hill know it is a very handsome house. That's probably an understatement. I mean, it's an absolutely
very
gorgeous
Third
home.
Virginia.
Very, very Virginia.
Very Third Virginia.
So Lafayette spends 3 days there at Oak Hill, reminiscing about wartime with Monroe. They're having a great time. Dignitaries are coming and going as they're there. And then the people of Leesburg find out. And they send a delegation down to Oak Hill to invite him to an entertainment up in Leesburg.
Oh,
Yeah. So after 3 days of rest and relaxation at Oak Hill, they hop on their horses and head up to Leesburg, where they are greeted by multitudes of people in the road, and they crowded forward to behold the veteran apostle of liberty. I love that quote. Again, the apostle of liberty. And the entire Loudoun County militia comes out. They're like lining the roads. He's got an escort of horsemen. They start setting off cannons as they approach the town of Leesburg. I know, Allison, I hope you're watching, because Cuthbert Powell was actually one of the militia officers who helped organize this. So shout out to your pals. Yeah, of course. And George Rust of Rockland was also there. So they escort Lafayette into town, and then they take this parade route in kind of a circle around through the town. It's actually funny because one of the places they go by is the Leesburg Ladies Academy, or the Female Academy. And Lavasseur, that secretary, actually particularly mentions that. He says something about, I got to get this quote right. He found that the ladies of the Female Academy were particularly interesting. And made a lot of very specific notes about what they were wearing and so forth. So
I imagine like he's driving by and like looking and got to cruise by the co-eds kind of a thing.
Yeah. I mean, this is, again, he's French, I don't know. But obviously they were having a really good time, and obviously the town of Leesburg made a really big impression on them. They started speeches at the courthouse. Monroe actually gives a speech about the veterans of the war. He specifically says, the veterans are regarded with a peculiar approbation by heaven and admiration and reverence by man, very much in the spirit of 1776. This generation, which is fading, almost gone, had done so much for the nation. Then they start with their toasts. You can't have a proper 18th, 19th century party without toasts. So, the first toast is obviously to the guest of honor, to Lafayette.
Lafayette.
They also toast George Washington, of course.
To George Washington.
Can't forget him.
They toast the American Revolution. Oh, okay.
I guess. For those loyalists of us, okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop doing the toast there because it goes on like 13 or 14 different things. I mean, they toast Simone Bolivar, the great South American liberator. They toast Henry Clay. They toast John Marshall, the Supreme Court Justice. On and on and on and on. So Lafayette's visit to Leesburg obviously made a huge impression. And that is going to be repeated about 2 weeks later as he's riding through Fauquier County. So Lafayette has just gone out to Culpeper and Albemarle and some of the other counties to the west. He's heading back through Fauquier County when he's approached by a troop of cavalry. And it turns out these are guys from the Fauquier militia who are inviting him to Warrenton for another feast. This is August 23rd of 1825. When he gets to Warrenton, he finds 5,000 or 6,000 people assembled there. Now, this is a time when Warrenton has only 900 residents. So pretty much like all of Fauquier County has come out to see the Apostle of Liberty. They assembled in the yard of the Norris Tavern, so kind of near where the Warren Green Hotel is today, right in the center of town. And again, we go through this whole range of toasts and drinks and stuff like this. John Marshall, who is a Fauquier County native, grown up not far from Warrenton, is actually there. So the Supreme Court Chief Justice is there as part of this celebration. He's giving speeches and orations. But what I find particularly poignant is when Lafayette is giving his speeches at Warrenton, he specifically recalls the memory of that day at the Battle of Brandywine. He knows that a lot of the men who fought alongside him that day and may have been there when he was wounded were actually from that area and may still be out there in the crowd. So I want to read, he gives this great toast, and I will raise my glass to this. To the memory of our countrymen, officers and soldiers of the 3rd Virginia Regiment, who gallantly fell in the defense of the rights of man.
The 3rd Virginia.
Rally to that one.
Mm-hmm. And
Very 3rd Virginia.
after he gives this quote, he actually calls out to the crowd and asks, is John Ashby in the crowd? This young Virginia captain who had been there at Brandywine, who had supposedly stood over him when he fell. And he finds out that Ashby had actually passed away 10 years earlier, and, got very emotional about that 50 years later, he remembered this specific incident that had happened on the battlefield, and called out for that man. Now, those of you who know the name Ashby know that's a big name in our area. John Ashby is actually the grandfather of Turner Ashby, who would become so famous during the Civil War. So these are families that are still in the area that harken back to this regiment. So after finding out that Ashby has been dead, Lafayette will give one final toast. And again, I will read that because I do think it's really great as if we're talking about how people remember this. He says, to the old Virginia line, the militia of 1781, and the present generation of Fauquier, may the revolutionary services of the fathers find everlasting reward in the Republican prosperity and happiness of their children. So again, that kind of passing the torch from this founding generation to their successors who have to keep that Republican prosperity and happiness going. Really interesting transitional time in American history. And of course, as we know with hindsight, that was not necessarily the case because, as I said, this is the tail end of the era of good feelings. It does not last long. Pretty soon we're driving headfirst into the kind of sectional divide that will eventually tear the country apart.
Yeah, the era of good feelings, except if you're an old Federalist. And you're
Yeah.
Yeah, or if you're a slave, or if
Some conditions do not apply, I think, is the asterisk,
Right.
for the era of good feelings.
Yeah, and from that story, a couple of things stand out. One, I think a pretty clear pattern we're going to see is when a generation's dying out of veterans, that then has such a huge implication on how people are viewing foreign policy, military, and wars that ultimately come up. Another thing of note from the comments section, what they really took away from your story is that you've got to bring the beard back.
Oh.
Your beard was very popular over the last few weeks, and they need the quarantine beard to come back.
Sorry, guys.
We should get a popularity, like a vote going on who likes Travis's beard more than Travis himself, kind of a thing of do they come for Travis? Do they come for the beard? I'm curious.
I'll put a poll up on Instagram. But
I know James is just here tonight for the 3rd Virginia, though.
I'm literally, when someone said 3rd Virginia, I was like, I'm all in.
Yes.
Yes, you
And
have.
at least James brought a beard.
Exactly. Well, I just wanted to emulate my public history hero, Mr. Travis Shaw, the Civil War general, old Salt and Pepper, who has lost both his salt and pepper. And so I just, I don't know how I feel anymore, and I feel like my whole presentation has to change. The 3rd Virginia did bring me up a little bit, but yeah, we'll have to keep working on that.
Yeah, I was also interested, 2 tracks. I think this is another theme that's going to come up throughout the night, is that a lot of times when people are remembering the war, they're also going to exhort the current and future generations to do or think, or there's kind of a command that comes out of remembrance too in a lot of cases.
Absolutely. And that's, if you read that, these accounts, every small town newspaper writes about when Lafayette comes to town, and all the speeches and toasts and stuff all follow that theme. It's very much, it's just as much a look towards the future as it is a look back at the past. They're not just reminiscing the battles and things like that, but it's really, letting the future generation know it's up to them to make this sacrifice worth it.
Yes, I know for a fact, and of course, Lafayette's visit itself becomes this huge phenomenon, as you said. The Fredericksburg Area Museum has, I believe in its collection, a step that they think Lafayette stepped on when he was back for the tour. So that's that. And the Warrenton Historical Society has a bottle of vodka that was given during his visit there too, and a glass that they believe he drank out of. So we have, physical items left over from this visit that are now this legacy that was like, I don't want to downplay. I don't want to say that it was just like a year-long kegger, because it wasn't, but the idea that his victory lap became a way to relive all those victories.
I mean, one of the coolest items in the collection at the Thomas Balch Library is a drawing of Lafayette that was done when he visited Leesburg. And the person chosen to greet Lafayette when he arrived was a young Thomas Balch.
Right.
This young child had to receive this great hero. And it really, I mean, that is, if that isn't symbolically passing the torch to a younger generation, I don't know what is. It's such a fascinating trip, and like you said, it has an incredible legacy. I mean, the first time I visited Oak Hill, I'm not one to revere these people in the past like saints or anything like that, or touch these relics, but the mantles and the fireplaces there were a gift to Monroe from Lafayette, and to actually be able to put my hand on that was pretty cool. I will admit. I'm a big Lafayette fan. So.
And Travis, we've got a question from Facebook. It's Jake Ivy. If we don't know how to answer this, let's just switch focus, and I'll get Jake distracted on the Chicago Bears. But his question is, the memory of this trip on Lafayette's decision to support the July monarchy in 1830.
Oh gosh, that is not.
That's a stumper.
That's not a question I am prepared to answer. My knowledge of the July monarchy is very thin. I
could talk a bit about it.
I know it's Lafayette's last revolution, and he's commanding the National Guard and all that, but talk about it, James.
Yeah, so Lafayette, is a double hero, and there's a double-edged sword to him, because he's also a hero in France for the French Revolution. Of course, apart from already being a celebrity, having gone over to support the Continental Army during the American Revolution. When the French Revolution breaks out and he accepts command of the National Guard, he's walking a very thin line, because he is a member of the nobility, he is a member of the aristocracy. So he, the reason the French tricolor is red, white, and blue, white's the color of the monarchy historically, and Lafayette insisted that was added to show the Bourbon monarchy at the time that, we believe in a constitutional monarchy. Obviously, that all goes down south, and with it, as does Lafayette's standing. And he actually flees the Revolutionary Army and gets caught up by the Austrians and spends years in prison with his family. So Lafayette's kind of a weird position, because he believes in these revolutionary ideals, but he sees a lot of what happened with the Montagnards during the French Revolution as being way too extreme, with all the guillotining, a little bit too much. So he does have a weird relationship when it comes to monarchy and revolutions. He's not openly a supporter of Bonaparte, but he also doesn't go very aggressively against Bonaparte, and Bonaparte awards him So he's a really interesting guy. And I think one of the things that comes out of his relationship with France and France's move towards republicanism is that he saw it in such a controlled environment, and the American Revolution was such a weird environment that France might not necessarily have been ready for. Or just the society was too different for it to have been conducted in the same way. So you really see that Lafayette always wanted to see the same revolution happen in France that happened in the United States. Unfortunately, the conditions just weren't right, but he doesn't stop pushing for that until the end of his life.
And I was going to say, that's kind of almost, I think, what he gets with the July Revolution is, kind of the expulsion of an absolute monarch and have it replaced with a more moderate system. So, yeah, again, I'm much more comfortable with the first French Revolution than with the July Revolution. So,
and what I think this shows too, and with the American Revolution, maybe as a good summary, is that again, views of a war diverge. And you have some who are advocates for it, someone like Thomas Paine, who gets disillusioned with how America goes forward. And then you have others who backtrack and think it goes too far. But a lot of the American patriots from the Revolutionary War abhor what goes on in France, as they see it as just slaughter and not really based on the ideas of the revolution. And of course, the ideas of the revolution impact decades now of foreign policy, especially what goes on between relations with Britain and France. And it really becomes really a reflection of how they view the war that they took part in as well. And it continues to grow, and you see various sectionalist reasons, for differing on the revolution as well. And that goes on for decades and even leads in some ways to another war within the United States, a civil war now. And Amber, you've got some stories for the
That's right. Some of you may have heard of the Civil War before. So stop me if you've already heard this one. So obviously the conflict 1861 to 65 divided the nation in a very literal way, geographically, not just politically or socially. And so after the war ended, the country was in a very unique position. So after the Revolutionary War, we know that there are parades and there are speeches and there's exhortations about liberty and the new republic and what that means, and everyone is kind of figuring it out together. But even though the Civil War had ended in 65, the divisions were still very much there. So there was this dissonance between how you would remember the war, depending on if you were from a northern state, or if you were from a southern state, or if you were from a southern state but you supported the Union, or if you were from a northern state but supported the South. And so there was, I think, a tremendous psychological effort to try and jive what had happened, especially in the southern states, which had lost, that they had prided themselves, and the South still prides itself on its military tradition, on the heroes that may or may not have fought in the 3rd Virginia, that were from here, that there were nation builders in the South, and that then their grandchildren or children in some cases had lost this war. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about Mosby, so John Singleton Mosby, who our organization is named for, and kind of how we understand what he thought about the war, both during and after it, because he was very vocal about what he thought, which is always fun when somebody doesn't hold it back any punches. So Mosby, of course, had been this partisan soldier during the war. And so he was in an irregular service. One thing that you can count on Mosby doing is to find his own path and to find a fight. He won't necessarily pick a fight, but he'll find one. And he usually takes up the cause of the underdog, whether he is a consul in Hong Kong, whether he is working for the Southern Pacific Railway, whether he's working for the land office, breaking up land barons, in Nevada. He always finds something to get his teeth into. And so after the war, Mosby is not someone who necessarily sees himself as lingering on the past. He hadn't supported secession to begin with, And he was very reluctant in joining the militia down in Bristol, Virginia. He admits that he didn't make a very good soldier. He wasn't very attentive, to showing up on time, and he didn't believe in secession, but he was there anyways and believed in his country and wanted to be part of it. But he really blossoms during the course of the war, and of course being given special responsibilities from Jeb Stuart to first perform operations here in Northern Virginia with just a handful of guys, and then in June of '63 getting a command of his own. And so he really believed in fighting, even if he didn't think he really believed in what Virginia was necessarily fighting for. And that's something that he was clear to state. By the 1870s, he's publicly stating that, I'm proud of what I did for the South, but I'm also proud of the country being one country again. So he goes to work being a lawyer after the war, and he publicly votes for Ulysses S. Grant, and he helps drum up votes for Republicans in Virginia, which of course is unheard of at the time. But I'm going to fast forward into the 1890s. By this time, Mosby is working for the Southern Pacific Railway, and he's usually out west in California working. And it's about this time that that individuals in his previous command of the 43rd, they want to have a reunion. And it just so happens, so in 1895, there's this drum up that, that folks want to have this reunion. Adolphus Richards is involved, Dolly Richards, who is one of the majors. You have you've got the Chapman, Samuel William Chapman. So you have, the regulars when you think of Mosby's Confederacy, that they want to meet up and have a good time. Mosby, though, has already said in a letter about a year ago that he thinks reunions and monuments, frankly, are a waste of time and money because they tend to inflame old feelings. But Mosby admits that he would go to a reunion if it was just with his own men, because you're seeing bigger Confederate reunion groups and they can really take on a mob mentality or life of their own, I think is Mosby's perspective. But he agrees to come to the reunion that is scheduled for January 16th of 1895. And so he comes over, and the reunion is interestingly held in Alexandria, not in the stronghold of Mosby's Confederacy in Salem or in Warrenton or in Middleburg or what have you. So it's in a hotel in Alexandria, and there are many newspaper reports written about this reunion of, Mosby's guerrillas, because Mosby is kind of a pop culture phenomenon at this point already. And every single newspaper, at least the ones, Washington, D.C. and North, they say multiple times how nice the anti-sectionalist reunion was that Mosby just happened to be at. But it was anti-sectionalism. There was nary a Confederate flag to be seen. The room was bedecked in American flags, the United States flag. Nevertheless, there were some good old rebels there. Ebba Hunton was there, Williams from the Black Horse Troop, and of course a bunch of these, ex-Rangers. And it's interesting because the newspaper report just kind of glances over the fact that many of these Confederates were giving toasts to the Army of Northern Virginia, to Robert E. Lee. They don't go as far as say as for the cause of the South, but they're definitely naming these southern pinnacles. I don't know what you might want to call them. And Mosby himself, his speech is written out in the Evening Star, one of the Washington papers, the next day. And in it, Mosby is very complimentary, of the men who fought with him, as he always was. And he echoes some of the words that he had given to them when he disbanded the battalion, then a regiment, which was actually this week, 155 years ago. The 21st is when it was. So he echoes some of those same words in saying, I am immensely proud of what this unit has done and the generous kindnesses shown to me. But he doesn't turn to some of the lost cause rhetoric that Jubal Early and others, Calhoun, etc., Stevens, are starting to say in terms of that theirs was the noble cause to the exclusion of the Northern cause, and that their society was the noble society to the exclusion of the Northern cause. And Mosby said specifically how wonderful it was that they were here on the Potomac and there weren't any gunboats and there weren't any pickets, and they were sitting here with their Northern friends, you know, and having a good time. And this is interesting. So this is 1895. This is interesting because within a couple of years, the timbre of these Mosby reunions becomes very, very different, even if they're still relatively small. It's also interesting to note this is the only Mosby reunion that Mosby himself attends. So this 1895 banquet was actually just a one-off event. And at that banquet, they decided, we need to do this all the time. We need to do this like once a year. We all need to meet up and cry and hug each other, which is a lot of what they were doing. And so plans are made, you know, to meet up subsequent years. Some people like to say that Mosby purposefully didn't attend anymore, but I believe he did intend to go to at least a couple more, but he was working in California at the time. And then one year he had appendicitis, which really sucks if you want to go to a party. But in 1899, there's another reunion held. And this is a special reunion. It's for the dedication of a monument in Front Royal to commemorate the 6 Southerners who were executed after being caught riding with Mosby. So these men had been captured during battle, perfectly legitimate, but then without any kind of trial, they were executed summarily. And this led in turn for Mosby to capture some Northerners and to execute them in kind and to send a warning to Sheridan saying, you know, don't execute my men. But that visual, that execution of these Southerners was so strong in the memories of the 43rd, the people of Front Royal, etc. And in 1899, they erect an obelisk to these men, and they have a whole reunion based around that dedication. And so in that, there are records in the Southern Historical Society that actually line out what the speeches were that day. They don't gloss over it. You can also be sure there were no American flags flying, but there were a lot of, you know, Confederate flags at that point. And so we have a lot of speeches, many of them from Adolphus Richards, again, and he's making parallels not only to the conflict of the Civil War, but then he's like making little jabs at modern politics too. So he says, you know, I have no need for the New South because the old Confederates are still the ones that are here running the towns and holding elected office and all those things. And he goes on to say, I have just as little use for the New South as I do for the new woman. Of course, an allusion to those bicycle riding hussies, you know, that you might find in the bigger cities. So that's a fun, you know, comment that he makes. And they go on and they talk about the martyrs. And that's a word that kind of pricked my ears because there was no reference to martyrdom in the 1895 reunion. So by 1899, every paragraph of this speech is littered with the martyrs, not just of the South, but these martyrs specifically who we're honoring with this monument, the martyred, you know, Southern women who gave up so much during the war. And we see all these allusions to religion and holiness that are now being tied to the Confederate cause in a way that can kind of legitimize a side that lost in a way that is still politically appropriate, because you can speak about your religious affinities and not necessarily be making a commentary on, you know, well, we're gonna secede again or whatever it might be. And so it's a really interesting phenomenon where you see those lost cause ideas not just starting to form, but where they pop up specifically within the realm of the 43rd and some of their reunions. And I realize that that's not a very funny story. So I do have one that's not funny, but is kind of awkward that I thought I would share. So as I said, Mosby was not shy about finding a fight. And so he had many written campaigns with people over, through those decades, in which he would critique, he would criticize a lot of these lost cause thoughts. Mosby was very clear to say that as far as he was concerned, the war was about slavery and he had heard of no other cause. He didn't regret that slavery was over. He was really glad that slavery had ended, but he admitted, my family owned slaves and, I can't discredit my family for owning them, but I'm glad that slavery doesn't exist now. It's an interesting kind of dialogue. But there was this one man, Christian Wells, I think might have been his name, and he had published a speech about how, slavery wasn't the cause of the war, and slavery wasn't that bad anyways, because slavery is a patriarchal institution, like a biblical patriarchal institution, and so that justifies it. And Mosby writes to his friend Montero, who was a ranger as well. He writes to Montero in 1907 and says, he says it's a patriarchal institution, but what about the other patriarchal institutions like polygamy or circumcision? And then he goes on to say, so you should ask him if he's circumcised, as like kind of throwing down. So if you ever wanted to like have a beat on whether or not men in that time were circumcised, that gives you a little clue. Maybe more than you ever really wanted to know about Mosby, but it is.
Now you do.
You can't unknow that.
I can't unknow that. Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Anne-Marie, are you ready for questions off of the audience?
Yeah, go for it.
Oh boy.
Two questions have come up. One about Mosby in terms of memory. Have there been any movies about John Mosby or plans to make movies about him?
So there are no movies that I am aware of. However, there is, of course, the television show, which aired, I think, from 1757 to 58, 32 episodes, and it's terrible. I cannot recommend. I think Mosby, the life of Mosby, would make a fascinating movie. But if you make it, you have to give me credit for giving you the idea.
I think you could play Mosby.
So, fun fact, Mosby was like, what, 5'7" and 128 pounds? That's this right here. So, yes, I could be Mosby.
Nice. And someone else wants to know about the status of the monument. Where is that monument? Is it still there?
So that's at the Prospect Hill Cemetery, I believe, in Front Royal, and it is there. It's a nice tall granite obelisk. And then at Front Royal, of course, they also have a large monument at the courthouse square that's more for all of those who served in the Confederate Army. Yeah.
And I wonder too about, Mosby, leans Republican. Others have leaned Republican after the war too. And that is, that's a big no-no in terms of ex-Confederates. How did some of his soldiers talk about him with that? Do you know?
So that's an interesting question. And all of the records that I could find is that all of the men who served with Mosby and interacted with him after the war still across the board respected him, loved him, they were all about it. Now that's of course with the caveat that when he was living in Warrenton after the Civil War, someone shot at him at the train station. So other people were not happy knowing that Mosby was a Republican and was drumming up support for Grant and other Republicans as well. In fact, some have speculated that's one of the reasons why he took the consulship in Hong Kong, and then went to work for the railway in California, and like maybe Virginia wasn't the most comfortable place for him anymore. I think it's more that Mosby wanted a new adventure, but I'm sure it didn't hurt that he had plenty of people giving him grief for believing that, maybe we should not have slavery anymore and let the war be in the past. I think that was Mosby's biggest thing, is he was fine actually hashing out what had happened when in the war. He liked the historical narrative of that. So after the 1899 dedication, there was a big speech during that reunion in which most of the blame, or there was some significant shade thrown at Grant for passing the order that was supposed to have justified the killing of those prisoners. And Mosby, in a response to the reunion, writes this long response about the order of events and when, Grant's telegraph would have gotten in and how far it would have had to come in order to reach Sheridan before the order was given. Really this long exoneration of Grant. That was his main concern at the time, was deciding, was it or wasn't it? So he was still very much wanting to examine the war, but he didn't want to live there anymore. He wanted everyone to be able to get on with it.
I think it's a really interesting point as well. And earlier on, you mentioned his quote about monuments kind of bringing back different flames, which is really interests me as I learn more about our local history here, thinking about the many Northern Virginians who served in loyal Union regiments,
Yes.
like the Loudoun Rangers, or was it Gray's Cavalry or White's Cavalry? Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. I'm really interested to know how the veterans of the Mosby's Rangers interacted with them, if at all.
You mean like with monuments or with the Loudoun Rangers?
With after the war.
Right. Well, we know that the Loudoun Rangers had their own reunions, and at least one occasion they had kind of a joint picnic thing, didn't they, Travis?
So there's on one occasion, Cole's Maryland Cavalry, which certainly fought with Mosby plenty of times, invited Mosby to one of their reunions, and Mosby writes again a long letter being like, "Look, I'd really love to, but I'm going to be out, out of the country or out in California or something. I can't make it, but like I would absolutely love to." And it's funny because that same reunion of Cole's Cavalry, which was happening in Harper's Ferry, one of the local papers in Shepherdstown writes that they had invited former Confederates to the reunion, but that knowing what Cole's had done in the area during the war, no Confederate would dare go see them. They had seen enough of Cole during the war to have enough, it's like, I don't know.
Yeah, there was definitely mixed response depending on who, what different areas thought of those actions. So, I mean, of course, the most famous cross-line reunion was the 1913 Gettysburg Reunion on the 50th anniversary, where you have all the pictures of them shaking hands over the stone walls, and all of that. But as far as I know, no demonstration that big ever happened between Union and Confederates, here in the Heritage.
It's important to remember too that was 50 years later. If you look at the reunions that are happening in the 1890s, or you look at what the GAR is writing, when Southern states are asking to have Confederate flags returned and stuff like that, and they're like, hell no, we bled for those. I'll be damned, over my dead body, kind of things.
Yeah, the GAR came down hard on Confederate veterans. At one point after Grant's death, the funeral procession, the parade in New York City, there was an extended invitation to Confederate soldiers, and a special one extended to Mosby in the 43rd Battalion, and everyone just kind of was like, we're not going to do that. And part of it was because the GAR were being hardliners about it, but the other part is for the Southerners. A couple of them said they didn't want to go to New York in March and have people shout at them in the streets, and call them rebels and traitors. So it's again an example of how right after the war they're trying to figure out how to jive all of this, and 40, 50 years later they're still. You still have to be careful.
Yeah, the reconciliation comes over time. We see a very similar thing after the Revolutionary War between loyalists and patriots. Reconciliation takes, decades.
And one of the key differences being that if you actually, a lot of loyalists were able to leave.
Yeah.
And maybe go to Canada, or go to England. And if you were in the South and you lost in the Civil War, you're not going to leave. You're still there, and you have to
go to Brazil like those guys did.
So it's a really fascinating time, to research and to see how this lost cause mentality, which scholars agree is this kind of mythos that was created. There's a lot of misunderstood fact about it, but that it served a purpose to get these white Southerners to think that they could participate again and still feel like they had honor.
Right.
And it was one way to find common ground between Union and Confederate white soldiers that they fought for, as a lot of them saw it, as valiant reasons. It was a way to reunify for some ways. And you also, just like with the Revolution, when a dying generation, is starting to pass, with the Civil War, there's a few Civil War veterans who fight in the Spanish-American War. But you
Yes.
mentioned 1899 and 1898. You get another when the horrors of the Civil War start to literally die out and those memories die out, you then get a more romantic vision of war and another generation who wants to prove that they can fight
Yes.
just like the stories
Yes.
they heard about. And
Yes.
it leads in a lot of ways to the Spanish-American War and the War of the Philippines. I don't know how much that carries on with the start of World War I. But James, I know you want to talk a bit about World War I. I don't know if you wanted to touch on if there's a connection between those up to the war.
There 100% is. And there 100% as well needs to be a lot more historiographical research done on it. One of the eras that I think we know the least about, but really need to do a better job of delving into is the United States in the First World War, and that generation of men and women who come up and serve as young men and women during the First World War, because they are children meeting their grandfathers, in some cases their fathers, who are Civil War veterans. And as well, they are going to be the leaders of the greatest generation, the young men, the Eisenhowers and the Pattons who are in their 20s, young lieutenants, captains, are going to be the generals of the Second World War. So it's a really interesting time. And when they look back at the American Civil War, you do see a bit of a divide at how they view it. And it's not necessarily down to geographical origin of the World War I generation, but it might just be down to who they're listening to. Perfect example of this is you will have young men, young women who see these reunions, whether they're North or South, and hear, the glorious stories. They might not hear the execution stories. They might not hear the blood and the gore. So when World War I rolls around, they see this opportunity to do their part like their grandfathers, their grandmothers, fathers, and mothers did during the Civil War on either side. But then you also have this other darker side to it. And that's kind of twofold. In the white community, you might be someone like President Wilson. President Wilson's a very controversial figure today, both on his stance on race in the United States, as well as his stance on the United States entering the First World War at all. Obviously, the First World War starts in 1914. The United States doesn't enter until 1917. Part of that, and a lot of people kind of lean towards this way, have to do with the fact that Wilson grew up in the Civil War era South. And not only dealing with Reconstruction, but he was in Virginia. He saw farms being burnt. He saw the bodies. He saw the devastation caused logistically in the area. So he had firsthand experience as a child with war. So you also have that aspect to it. And then, of course, you have, especially in this area, the African-American side of it. Most servicemen, servicewomen in the First World War are going to be drafted. Volunteerism isn't as large of an idea, and African-Americans are going to be drafted on the same scale as white Americans. In most places in the United States, on war memorials after the war, you're going to see them all kind of listed together. But in the ex-Confederacy in the South, they are still separate. I'm in Arlington, and my local war memorial in Clarendon is segregated still to this day. They mixed for the Second World War, but in the First World War, there's a clear white and colored section.
Yeah, as is Leesburg. So
Yeah,
and
well,
you did that with us doing our video series last summer.
So just like, all of American history, there's a lot of different views. But going into the First World War and in the years after the First World War, there is a lot of harking back to that Civil War generation, down to the point that there's a mass industrialization of memory. So, for example, if you served in, let's say, an infantry regiment, and you say, well, I want to write the official history for my kids and my grandkids to read years from now, you could subscribe to a publisher who would print whatever you wrote and kind of fill in the stenciled pictures, right? And one of the options in one of the publishers was, do you want Union or Confederate veterans waving you off at the train station?
Wow.
And so there's, if you look at some of the Southern units, particularly local guys here, like the 116th Infantry, that's the Virginia National Guard Regiment, their history, as well as, for example, 30th Division, which is from North, South Carolina, and Tennessee, they got Confederate veterans waving them away with Confederate flags. Look at Northern units, and it's all GAR vets. And there's a lot of propaganda issued when the United States enters the First World War, with doughboys getting ready, young men with their grandfather who served in the Civil War and their father who served in the Spanish-American War standing over both their shoulders. There's also a lot of talk of reunification, because unlike in the American Civil War, where you could talk about, Mosby's Rangers, and most of the men, the majority, are from Northern Virginia, you might be serving in the 318th Infantry, which are in theory all Virginians, right? From mainly the Tidewater region and Northern Virginia and parts of the Shenandoah Valley, part of the Blue Ridge Division. But once those first casualties are sustained and the guy from Warrenton and the guy from Leesburg is wounded, there's no guarantee that other Virginians are going to come and replace them. You might have someone from Los Angeles and you might have someone from Minnesota. So for the first time in American military history, you're not just the 1st Virginia Infantry, you're a United States infantry regiment. You have men serving from all over, and you're mixing with different groups for the first time. As well, just like the Union Army in the Civil War, the American forces in the First World War, 1 out of 4 men are immigrants. In the 77th Division, which is a division predominantly recruited out of New York City, they speak 42 different languages. So there's going to be a huge mix of guys who come from, let's say, Leesburg, who for the first time is meeting an immigrant. So that's going to bring about a real big change in just the idea of what it means to be an American and what it means to contribute to society. First World War veterans as well are different because there's a large amount of women who are involved. For the first time in military history, women are part of the war effort. They're serving in uniform. They're not part of the combat arms. That doesn't come about really until the day we're living in now. But, you know, they are members of the military, though some of them have to fight for pensions later on. As well, African Americans on a mass scale from the start of the war, as I mentioned before, are involved. You do get some of that racist tendencies which go from the United States over to France with the American forces. And a lot of times it's not until the Americans show up that you start to see blacks only or whites only or blacks only on cafe signs, whereas the other allies didn't have that going on. French colonial troops from Africa would be treated the same for the most part as other French soldiers. And African-American soldiers pick up on this, and they come back from France and Belgium with their experience saying, well, we had it kind of good over there when we were interacting with the Europeans. Why can't we have it this way? And we actually have a local soldier here who's one of the most famous African-American soldiers of the First World War, Freddie Stowers, who wins it's awarded the Medal of Honor by Barack Obama. He was cited to be awarded the Medal of Honor, but due to racism in the Army at the time, they pushed away the citation. So it wasn't until President Obama that he was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions. So that kind of still goes on to this day. And I think the issue with the First World War is that it falls right in between that pivotal time in American history, the Civil War, and the time where we saved the world, which is, you know, the Second World War. World War I doesn't have a clear end. It doesn't have okay, the country's unified again, slavery is illegal. It does not have the fascism is gone, it won't come back. It carried right on into the next war, so people tend to forget it. And that drives me absolutely insane, because you had the higher chance of being killed in action as an American soldier in World War I than you do in any other war. We suffer, it becomes our third bloodiest war, and we're really only in combat for about 7 or 8 months. Most Americans don't arrive until the spring of 1918, and the war ends November 11th, 1918 as well. You've got very timely to talk about now, Spanish influenza, which was the last major pandemic, which basically shut down the country. And we're going through the same arguments politically now as we were then, with the upside that we don't have a major world war going on yet. So it's an absolutely fascinating time. And the way we remember it is varied region to region, town to town. There are national organizations formed like the American Legion, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and a lot of that has to do with lobbying for veterans. They saw what happened to the Civil War veterans and all the various regional organizations, and then you have the GAR in the north and various Confederate veterans organizations down here. But they said, well, we really want that political power. We want to make sure that when the boys come home, they get what was promised to them and they get the support that they need. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen for them, because as we talk about the 10-year anniversary of the Civil War, with Mosby's guys getting back together, other veterans getting back together, for World War I veterans, it's the height of the Great Depression. So no one has the time or the money to get stuff together. So you get organizations like the Bonus Army. World War I veterans marching on Washington, demanding what was promised to them in their bonuses so they can feed their starving families. And they're driven off by the Army. We fire on American veterans, right? Go to the 25th year anniversary. Try to remember the First World War then. It's 1943. We've got something else going on, which we'll hear about a little bit later. Go to the 50th, and we're in the middle of the Vietnam War. So a lot of these guys don't get the recognition that they deserved. You will see small town monuments at most, really, for the First World War vets. Leesburg has an absolutely amazing one just outside the courthouse, which I highly encourage you to go to. And there are other scattered ones throughout Northern Virginia. And a lot of the celebrities of the First World War are also local guys here. A Marine captain, a Marine Major Williams is famously said, hell, we just got here, when a French officer asked him to retreat during the fight for Belleau Wood, and he's killed later. He's also buried here, just outside of, I believe,
Lloyd Williams. He's buried in Berryville.
Very
Yeah.
well.
So and we had a post a few months ago where we actually went to his grave. You've got various other soldiers buried under First World War monuments throughout local cemeteries as well. So it's a hidden presence. One thing that's kind of controversial is there's no memorial to the First World War on the National Mall. There's a memorial to people from the District of Columbia. Which confuses people right a lot. All of the names on that memorial are just District of Columbia servicemen, interestingly not segregated. The First World War veterans, however, did think that they had a memorial. The unknown soldier was the memorial to the dead of the First World War. Now we've added an unknown soldier from World War II and one from Korea. But that memorial kind of, for them, was their, final word. You also have the issue that a lot of guys just wanted to forget. And it's very similar to Mosby stories. The experience of the guys who served in France and Flanders was absolutely horrendous. Meuse-Argonne, you're talking about units suffering over 100% casualties in many instances. The 318th Infantry, mainly local guys, are going to be slammed into the first wave of the Meuse-Argonne on September 26, 1918, right after a bombardment in which the American artillery fires more shells in a 5-hour period than the Union Army did in the entire Civil War. And these guys are going to be thrown just right into this, and they're going to be almost nonstop fighting until November 11th. Meuse-Argonne to this day remains the largest and bloodiest battle the United States has ever fought, and I doubt you'll find many people on the street, if you pulled them over and asked them, have you ever heard of the Meuse-Argonne? They might not tell you. That's something that, going back to what Travis was saying, kind of drives me nuts, because most towns in America, I feel like, have a Lafayette Street, right? Or a Lafayette Drive or something like that, or a Washington Street. I live right off of a Pershing Street, which is kind of cool, being the commander of the AEF in the First World War, but you won't see many references to Argonne. There's an Argonne Labs in DC. That's about it. But so there's kind of this real hidden history of this horrible experience that we had that's really covered up. You also have a growing understanding among First World War vets as compared to Civil War vets among psychological injuries. Mm-hmm. The Veterans Administration is set up as a response to the service of First World War vets and the amount of men coming back wounded, or whether that be physically or mentally. So you really see in that a beginning of an understanding of how do we treat veterans. You see an understanding of how do we treat the dead. Right. Every American is guaranteed, if they're killed in action and their body is known, they know where it is, their family will have the option of either A, burying them in the closest American cemetery, B, getting them sent to a state cemetery, a national cemetery in their state. So for Virginia, it would be at a place like Fort Lee or Fort Pickett, Fort Lee being just outside Petersburg, or being brought back to the family. So for years after the First World War, especially 1920, 1921, boats are just bringing just caskets over, and a lot of those guys are going to be buried in local cemeteries. So if there's one thing I want everybody, especially watching from the Mosby area, to think about, is when this pandemic is all over, or if you want to go for an interesting walk during the pandemic, get outside for a bit, go visit one of the local cemeteries. Travis, Anne Marie, and I just a few months ago were walking through, I think it was Old Church Cemetery just south of Middleburg.
Old Chapel out near
the Old Chapel. Yeah.
There is a huge amount of World War I vets there. And what's interesting for me is they all mention where they served. A lot of them have Meuse-Argonne written on their gravestones. A lot of them have their units written on their gravestones. And these are guys who I don't believe have got the justice of their story told yet. So I think that's something that we really need to grow on, especially as we look at the issues that we're still dealing with today. And as we move from the First World War sort of into the Second World War, I think it's important to note that we don't see the same issues that World War I veterans suffer with: lack of medical care, lack of financial support because of the GI Bill, which comes out just after the Second World War, because of the experience they saw with groups like the Bonus Army after the First World War. So there's a very wide array of stories to get into, but I think why I chose not to go with a specific story is that so few people understand the First World War. So few people really give it the time of day. And I highly encourage people to look at Northern Virginia's story during the First World War, because it's fascinating. Outside of the wartime governor being a Leesburg guy, there's so much going on here, both with memory of the First World War, development of civil rights, development of suffragette rights, rights for women. Obviously, there's a lot of women who are actually trained in to help run the farms while a lot of the men are the way in the First World War, specifically out towards Winchester. Mm-hmm. So in that, make sure to kind of get in and investigate your local history. There's a famous historian, I know we all know who he is, who said the Revolution created the United States, but the Civil War defined it. One of the few interesting things I think he said, but I'm going to run on that and say the American Revolution created the United States, the Civil War defined it, but the First World War created the modern American. And that's why I think it's really important for us to look at it and study it, especially in our local histories.
Yeah, and with the war, I mean, you see a rapid mobilization of an army that was in horrible condition. I mean, the United States, people don't realize how there was kind of a anti-standing military mindset in the country for a long part of our American history. The idea of having a large standing army is still a pretty modern concept.
Absolutely. And, so just to give you an example, when the United States enters the First World War, we have a smaller standing army than the Belgian army. Including the National Guard, which are part-time soldiers, we only have about 300,000 men. By the time the war ends, we'll have 4 million men and women in uniform, 2 million of which will have gone overseas. So just in that year and a half period, it's a total practice run for the Second World War. It makes that run up that arsenal of democracy possible as we look into 1939, 1941.
Yeah, from that to what you see at the end, and you made a good point. I mean, the United States is not in the war long, but they're violently in it when they are in it. And in the final 6 months, I think the statistic is, I can't remember the exact numbers, but we average more deaths per day in the last 6 months than the British, and just under, I think, what the French come in at.
Just about. When we talk about looking at the Civil War, like the Battle of Antietam, bloodiest day in American history, right? About 21,000 casualties. The bloodiest month in American history is October 1918. And that's nonstop, averaging about 5,000 to 6,000 casualties a day. And that's the height of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. And these are guys who are being wounded, coming back potentially. These are guys showing up who might never have fired a rifle because we've been just sending them out overseas to get them out in the field as quickly as possible. There's an account from the 77th Division, NCO, who has a man crawl up to him while they're under machine gun fire, who's saying, "Sergeant, how do I fire my rifle?" So it's something that's kind of unheard of, and we don't think about that often, but an absolutely fascinating, both for military and social history, a perfect case study that we really need to dive into a bit more.
Yeah, and you mentioned.
So, I was just gonna ask James's question just based on, Travis and I, of course, have talked about what we might consider as like mainstream wars, and I guess you're the
hipster war.
Here. Yeah, I guess, but in terms of scholarship, of course, the Civil War and the American Revolution have countless sources, and constant study of these things. And I'm not tuned into the World War I genre of scholastic offerings, of books being written, etc. And as far as what which is vastly more, do you see the American market of scholarship on World War I lacking in comparison to other wars? Yeah. And or in comparison to European sources? Like, what is that like?
Yeah, I think, a trip to any major bookstore for me is always interesting because I do focus on the First World War, but I went to school for it in the United Kingdom. So it is always interesting for me because for them, the First World War has much more of what we would consider like a Civil War feel, where it impacts them every
It's
day.
home. Yeah.
Everybody, every family lost somebody, and it's in living memory for people. There are people whose fathers served. There are people who, the last British veteran died in 2009, the last American one in 2012. I mean, we were all alive when there were World War I vets alive. We can't say that about Civil War vets. I don't know about Travis, but the rest of us can't say that about Civil War vets. But
I did meet Frank Buckles before he died, the last American veteron of the war. That was
cool.
amazing.
Also a relatively local guy. He was from West Virginia.
Yeah, Martinsburg, West Virginia area. Yep.
So it is different. Absolutely, especially when we look at how cataclysmic it was for Europe. Because the battles are not being fought here, and because we're in it for such a short period, it might not feel like it has the same impact on us, but it really does. I think that in terms of American scholarship work that's being done, whether teaching people about the First World War, we're very far behind the other wars. And I think at some point, public historians are going to have to sit down and realize there's only so many more books on the second day at Gettysburg we can write before we've written all of it, right? The Meuse-Argonne, as I mentioned, largest American offensive, bloodiest American offensive in American history. I can probably on my fingers count how many books have been written on it. It's insane to think of. We also highlight specific stories, right?
Sure.
So Gettysburg, Chamberlain, the 20th of Maine, Stonewall Jackson at First Bull Run, or Manassas for our southern viewers. But for World War I, we highlight the Lost Battalion, which was in the Meuse-Argonne, Sergeant York's story, which was in the Meuse-Argonne. And then we tend to, if we do teach the First World War, we tend to come at it from a British perspective because it's probably taught through the literature. We probably teach J.R.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, his experience in the First World War, how much that impacted him. Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, the war poets. So we don't really get an interesting look at who the American was of the First World War and the impacts of it. The bloodiest race riots in American history are just after the First World War. I don't know if anybody watched the awesome show The Watchmen, which came out last year.
Yes.
Yeah,
We're
Tulsa.
talking about the Tulsa race
Tulsa,
riots.
yeah.
And one of the specifically targeted groups during these race riots were returned African American soldiers. They were thought that they had seen too much in France. They knew how to handle weapons, and they were a danger to the white community. So we really need to revisit the First World War, both on and off the battlefield, because I think that's going to give us a much better understanding of who we are today. And again, as I mentioned before, I don't think the First World War has gotten the justice done to it, even though we're through the centenary.
James, we got a question on Facebook about if you have a recommendation for reading about Meuse-Argonne.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few really good books out there. My favorite as an introduction to the Meuse-Argonne, which covers all of it really, is a book by Edward Langle, who also is a local guy. He was at the University of Virginia, and it's called To Conquer Hell. That is a really good introduction, I think. And then as well, if you want a personal story, I would look up Hervey Allen's Into the Flame. He was a Pennsylvanian, but he gives a really good account of what it's like to be a doughboy in the front line. But definitely pick up Ed Langle's book because it's full of primary sources and interviews with veterans. So
yeah, I just picked up Mitch Yackelsen's book.
Yeah.
Looking forward to getting into that.
Also has a really good new one, which I have called 48 Days. I had to look at the title. It's right there on my bookshelf. That was the length of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. So you can't go wrong with either of those two books. And also make sure to look at some of your local history publications as well, because since we're through the First World War centennial, you're going to have seen a lot of historic societies having published some articles and stuff like that. Definitely dig in. The reason I got into history as a young kid growing up in Michigan was I read about our Civil War veterans who served in the Iron Brigade or the Michigan Cavalry Brigade. And from there got interested in World War I. So definitely try to connect locally as well with that.
Yeah, we have a great book called Letters from Edgar's Trunk. It was written by a local African-American woman who found, I think it's her great uncle's trunk up in the attic. He was an African-American soldier who served in the First World War, and the trunk was just full of dozens and dozens and dozens of letters.
Yeah.
So she took those and published them, and it's a really amazing insight into the African-American experience and local Virginian experience in the war.
Awesome. And another question we got, we talked about it actually on our first virtual History on Tap about the pandemic that you'd mentioned, and you mentioned the fall of 1918, and the spread and severity of the Spanish flu with mixing of soldiers. And of course, I know there's a huge issue with American soldiers being sent over to Europe and helping spread it. I know it went through the German camps, but anything quickly you wanted to add to the relation to this flu in the months of the war?
Yeah, absolutely. So World War I is the last war where disease kills more men and women than bullets in the United States. Different for some of the European countries, but we know who patient zero was. It was a cook in Kansas at Camp Funston. And so we know it was a direct result of the amount of people in the military machine. The reason we call it Spanish flu is because Spain, being neutral, was not censored, and the first newspapers to report on it were in Spain. So everybody said, those dang Spanish. But it came from Kansas.
And Kansas flu.
Kansas flu epidemic.
So, which kind of sounds more like a weird football play,
Yes.
honestly. But
Spanish flu, audible to the Kansas flu.
yeah, absolutely. We know it went on troop ships over to Europe and claimed just tons of lives. And it was a massive issue because it coincided with the Meuse-Argonne offensive. So the worst wave of it is in the fall of 1918, and it lasts into 1919. So you will see graves of men who were killed as served in the First World War, served in the military, but they were Spanish flu casualties. It gets really bad here in Virginia at Camp Lee, just outside of Petersburg, what's now part of the Petersburg National Battlefield. That's where a lot of doughboys from across the country were converging to train. As well, 4 out of 5 American troops leave and come back through New York City. The other 1 out of 5, so a full 20%, come in and out of Newport News. So that's going to be a hive of influenza as well, which will, of course, unfortunately spread through the rest of Virginia. So Virginia has a really close history to that pandemic, unfortunately.
Wow. And I'll make a plug too to watch our first virtual History on Tap, where we cover all sorts of pandemics and diseases and cures, and we talk about 1918 in there, which is on the Facebook page. Well, if you all have any other comments, I'll jump ahead to World War II. And I know
Let's do it.
Yeah, we're running short on time, and I wanted to save some time to get your thoughts on things. So I'm going to cut out a little bit of what I was going to talk about. But I think looking at the memory of World War II covers a lot of the themes that we've seen in all of American history about how we remember war, where sometimes you obscure the bad and you want to promote the good aspects of war. And what you get sometimes is a romanticized version of it. And I don't want to give a particular story this week. I'd rather just talk about an idea. But if you want about Loudoun during World War II, I did an interview a couple weeks ago with Richard Gillespie. It's on the Loudoun Museum Facebook page about Loudoun during World War II. So since we did that, I want to focus on the idea of the greatest generation. So if you're at home and you three, if you ever heard someone lament times not being as good as it was for the greatest generation in that class, take a drink. I definitely have.
Also, let's remember that the greatest generation named itself.
Yeah.
Right?
We'll point that out. And they were led by the World War I generation. I also want to point that out.
They were led by the World War I generation, and they did name themselves. And it didn't even become a popular phrase until Tom Brokaw wrote a book called The Greatest Generation in 1998. So this is not a phrase that's been around since them patting themselves on the shoulder since the war concluded that they were the best. This is a 1990s phenomenon, which, not surprisingly, is just after the Gulf War and after a very lengthy culture war that had been going on for a couple of decades, where, again, you want to look back at a more simplistic time. But there's a couple of general ideas that formulate about the greatest generation. And unfortunately, what it leads to isn't necessarily calling the greatest generation a myth, but more so that it leads to a one-dimensional image of what World War II was really like, both from a military standpoint and on the home front. So there's a couple very common kind of myths that people float around a lot, like products were made more sturdy and better back then. Kids were better behaved in the 1940s. College students were more studious. People had more respect for the vows of marriage. There were no atrocities committed by the military in World War II.
No.
There's no PTSD. These are myths that have popped up about World War II. I mean, when you look at polling from the 1940s, people were actually pretty frustrated with how adolescents behaved. 9% of a poll said kids behaved better during the war, but the vast majority said they acted much more out of line during the war than acted better. In terms of college students, 59% of Americans couldn't locate China, a major ally, on a map. I don't know what it'd be like today, but 59%. In terms of marriage being taken more sacred, there's a huge spike in divorces because of the strain of the war. In 1946, just after the war, there's 600,000 a record divorces. So it's not the rosy picture that a lot of people think. And what that does is has an effect on future wars, particularly Vietnam and even the Gulf War in the 90s, because of how people look at World War II and use that as an equation to solve current problems. And there's always been a quote that stood out to me by Admiral Jean LaRocque. And he said, "World War II has warped our view of how we view things today. We see things in terms of that war, which in a sense was a good war. But the twisted memory of it encourages the men of my generation to be willing, almost eager, to use military force anywhere in the world." And he said it in relation to the shadow of Vietnam. And you do see a lot of that with, I think, a lot of wars, how the reflection of a previous war influences foreign policy and current wars today. But just to quickly, I'm going to cut out some of these things, mention about why and how this necessarily comes about in such a way for World War II. There's a couple of main things. For one, there is government censorship of the materials. So newspapers aren't reporting about atrocities. They're not reporting about the discrimination of minority troops, which are segregated, even murders that happen of segregated troops by American soldiers or other atrocities. They don't make it in newspapers. There's an Office of Censorship, which watches everything that's coming out publicly and privately. Journalists admit after the fact that they very much painted and slanted stories in favor of the war and for the United States for what's going on. You also see it with generals realizing that PR is a big deal. There's a very famous photo of General MacArthur returning back to the Philippines. There's a particularly famous one, and that's always been debated about how staged that one was. But what we do know is that MacArthur has a lot of photos and videos taken of him arriving at multiple beaches at the tail end of the war, returning back to the Philippines, as he wants to get the correct image for the PR. And he has hundreds of different press releases that he puts out, and he wants it shot on multiple beaches. His whole phrase, "I shall return," was manufactured by staff. You see other generals. Eisenhower had 50 or so cameramen shooting the right angles of them after D-Day, when them going to Normandy. Patton is known for his very passionate speeches. Those were very much choreographed as well. So again, the image going back from the war front to the home front was very much crafted by government, by PR, and journalists themselves wanting to not speak of some of the negative aspects. But a big part of it too is Hollywood and the movies that were coming up and the increase of film. Also, you see a very unrealistic view of what World War II was like. Videos during the war and just after, again, show this as a completely unrealistic aspect of what the war is. American soldiers die heroically. They don't die painful deaths or gruesome ones. That's typically saved for the enemy. You see a lot of examples of kind of the painless and unrealistic versions of what the war is. There's one that I'll point out called South Pacific, based on a book. And go on YouTube and look at the trailer for South Pacific. It's outrageous, to say the least, in terms of how they're viewing almost the Pacific War. It's like a paradise, and nurses are stupid. They're basically sex objects. There's no South Asian diseases and atrocities that are going on there. Just totally unrealistic version of it. And you see a conflation of that plus what the reality is. And it's not that people are necessarily being duped. For example, you see acceptance and willingness and desire for this actually of people who are serving too, where it helps them see the war as they want to see it on the screen and help them cope with how they actually view the reality of the war. I'm going to cut out a little bit of the other stuff I was going to talk about, so we had a couple minutes. Ultimately, I think what you see with World War II and then how Vietnam soldiers, they want to fight like the stories they heard for a good war. They want to volunteer for it. And even a more simplistic version of why World War II happened, kind of a wrong simplistic view of that, and then be an equation for how you deal with dictators and other nations as well, and how war becomes a solution and diplomacy sometimes is seen as weak, as is the case with appeasement, how people viewed 1938 with the appeasement of Hitler.
Joe, I think something that you said about South Pacific really jumped out at me because, you see, of course, similar things with film for the Civil War too, most notably things like Gone with the Wind or Song of the South, of ways to patch, plaster over some of those cracks in the actual history. And to an extent you see that with the Revolutionary War too,
yeah.
but that's more about like really mythologizing the past, where I think the interesting thing with World War II Civil War and World War I is that's all in the belt of film becoming a medium.
Yeah, and with filming, that adds a whole other equation to it. I mean, look at the Civil War films from the 1940s, not just, Gone with the Wind type ones. I mean, you get a very simple version of war, and really just society too. I mean, it's not just war with that, but then people digest that, they want that. I mean, Ronald Reagan, for example, like refused to admit that armies in World War II were segregated. He saw in film black and white soldiers together, and he was certain that
That's what happened. Yeah.
They were not. It didn't become desegregated until 1948 by Truman, post-war. But because of how people viewed it in film, they wanted to accept that as reality.
Yes.
And people always talk about history. If you don't study history, it's bound to repeat itself. Historians never like that phrase. History doesn't repeat itself, but it can replicate itself. And it's not necessarily because of not studying the war. It's sometimes of wrongly remembering it in a way that wasn't realistic.
Yeah.
What I've always heard is that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think that's very true, because you see those themes like repeating, as we've seen tonight. They come back, but it's always a little bit different, or it's changed because of new technology or new world horizons, that we're working with.
I think, it was fascinating when we point out, because I remember growing up, my dad was super into aviation. And I kind of I think part of my history love comes from us watching old war films where, like 12 O'Clock High, which is one of the rare kind of anti-war films that comes out. But I remember growing up, as you mentioned, South Pacific, watching the Black Sheep Squadron TV show, which is like, oh man, it's like a frat house. And occasionally they had to fly like the Japanese.
Yep.
So I think it's really fascinating. And as they hark back to other eras, as you guys said, 1941, the big movie that came out that year was Sergeant York. Yeah. So calling back to the First World War. So it's absolutely fascinating. I guess I do kind of have a question for you though, which is, do you think that's changing a bit? I mean, with our generation, I grew up watching Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, and those don't paint the rosy picture in the same way. They do kind of do the patriotism, but do you think that's changing at all?
I mean, it looks like it changes, and I think it could be because there's more ability to make films and there's just a wider variety of it. And it probably is because we went through, I think, an Iraq war that frustrated a lot of people, where we want the truth and we don't want to be misled in any way, or we view maybe war a little more, I don't want to say negatively, but realistically.
Yeah.
So I think that has a large role to play in it as well, because in the 1940s, they wanted that perception. They weren't being duped. Those are what sold. The realistic documentaries and movies that showed war and more PTSD kind of things, those did not sell well. They were not consumed by the people.
Yes.
Yeah, I think in some way it speaks to a larger conversation that we've all had as historians, as far as, authenticity and how, what constitutes an authentic view of the past, and how can we, we've talked about this with like historic house museums or living history sites. I think younger people are looking to interact in history in ways that they view as authentic. They want the warts and all story. They want to see, they want to understand history taken in both its good and its bad, as opposed to just these purely kind of black and white views of the past.
Yeah,
I think that's a post-Vietnam thing that really, 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 really picks up in, like you said, the post-Iraq war, where I think we're a little more cynical about some of the the ways that history has been told or presented in the past. And a lot of people try to couch that as like anti-American or anti-patriotic, whoa, you just dwell on the bad stuff. I don't think that's it at all. I think it's towards a more complete understanding of the past.
I think you're right, Travis, and I think people today of multiple generations, but I think in addition to authenticity, I would like to believe that people are more understanding that the good and the bad exist together.
Right.
Yeah. World War I and II, those were good and noble fights that needed to be fought, but also terrible things were done, by people wearing American uniforms, and that's not good. That's not noble. But the idea that those two things exist together, and that's a legacy that we all have to live with, and maybe that's going to be the memory of war 40 years from now, for conflicts that we're engaged in today.
Absolutely. I know we're out of time. Emery or Travis, do you want to give a clue to what we're doing next week? We've mapped out the next several weeks of History on Tap.
Oh.
Give them the clue. Give them the clue. So next week's theme is going to be music. And we will be exploring kind of the history of music in our Northern Virginia area. And as special guests, we have Bess Putnam, who is a local musician, and she's also bringing some of her friends, whose information will be in the bio.
Yeah, thankfully I will not be playing, so you're safe. Please tune in.
No, we're not making a band. That's the takeaways. We're not starting a band. Not yet. We're not that desperate. But we will have musicians joining us next week while we're talking about some of the history of music, and how this area played a part in it. So it'll be a lot of fun. None of the three of us will be singing. You're welcome.
I'm going to be singing off screen while I watch.
James is going to be singing off screen. That's going to be on a separate stream if you want to participate.
I will say before we go, we also, Mosby Heritage Area is introducing a new live program starting tomorrow. Tomorrow at 5 o'clock, you can tune into our Facebook for something we're calling Live at 5. We're getting a local historian to talk local history. We're starting it off with Rich Gillespie and his wife Tracy Gillespie. Both of them are history professionals with deep roots in the Northern Virginia area. So please tune into that again tomorrow at 5. Anything else, guys?
No, and again, we really appreciate everyone watching every week. Both the Mosby Heritage Area and the Loudoun Museum, we have membership programs, the lifeblood of our organizations, especially during these times. So if you enjoy the programs, not just this one, but we also, both organizations have other programs that we do every week, both virtually and via blog. So definitely become a member and support your local institutions. And James, really appreciate you coming in and giving
thank you, James Taub.
This was very 3rd Virginia, so I'm very happy. Yeah.
That's the highest compliment he can give.
I can't think of anything better. I want everybody to live their lives very 3rd Virginia.
Very 3rd Virginia.
You and Lafayette.
Well, I think that's a good sign-off point to Lafayette, to the 3rd Virginia, to local breweries, and to the Buffalo Bills.
And to you watching at home.
You guys watching at home.
Viewers like you. Thank you.